hour, so I suggest that we begin. For those of you who weren't here this morning, my name is Barry Sander. I'm an assistant professor at Leiden University. I'm one of the co-conveners of this series on teaching international law, and it's my pleasure to welcome you warmly to the afternoon webinar, which we are delighted to co-organize with the International Committee of the Red Cross. I'd like to thank the ICRC for putting together this amazing panel. We're in for a real treat. And what I will do is I will now hand over to Jean-Pierre, who will take you through some of the logistics of how things will work today.
Thank you very much, Barry. Yeah, just two quick things about logistics. So one is that we encourage all participants to tweet as we go through the webinar this afternoon. To do that, we suggest that you use the hashtag teachingIL and the Bickle handle, which is at BIICL on Twitter. The second thing I wanted to cover is the questions. So we ask that you submit questions via the Q&A box, which you can see on your screen, and not via the chat box. The chat box will be used if any of the panelists would like to share any links, etc. with you, but any questions should be put through the Q&A box. And we ask you to monitor the Q&A box so that if there are questions that you particularly like or that you would particularly like to see discussed by the panelists, you can upvote that question so that it goes to the top of the pile. We might not have time to discuss all of the questions received, but rest assured that the panelists will see all of the questions and will react to them or will think about them afterwards. And I'm sure that panelists would be okay with people contacting them directly to continue some of the discussions that we know will follow from the conversation this afternoon. With that in mind, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Etienne Kuster, who will be chairing this afternoon's webinar. Etienne is a legal advisor for relations with academic circles at the ICRC in Geneva and has worked with the ICRC since 2006, including missions in Pakistan and Thailand. And now his role is to oversee and support the interaction between the International Committee of the Red Cross and academic institutions for promotion of law and humanitarian action. Etienne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sander. Thank you, Barry, for the opportunity to speak today and to address a very important question in our opinion. So distinguished professors and lecturers, dear students, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and good morning, and good evening to all. I'm very pleased to be chairing this panel, and I would like to give a warm welcome to our audience and panelists, and to thank you very much for joining us to exchange on what we believe is a very important and under-discussed matter. I would like also to warmly thank the British Institute for International and Comparative Law, and in particular Dr. Sander and Dr. Gauci and all their staff for setting up such a brilliant series of webinars, as well as for giving us the opportunity to touch upon today's topic. The diversity of topics, I have to say, and perspectives is truly impressive, and we hope this panel will add to that. Before we start, and as they were already given, just only a few housekeeping rules to help the panel run smoothly. So normally the audience is muted by default, and I will ask also the panelists to unmute themselves when they speak only. As much as we will try to regroup questions addressing similar points in the chat box so that we can group them and have a sound discussion. And also to mention that one presentation will be delivered in Arabic with live translation in English by ICRC staff. So more time has been allocated accordingly to that one. So for the sake of time, I will only briefly present the panelists before giving them the floor, and their short biographies should normally display during their respective presentations at the beginning. So now, moving on to today's topic for discussion. Is teaching IHL, International Humanitarian Law, in crisis a strategic response for troubled times? Maybe before we enter the live discussion, we need to understand better the context of this question. And for this, allow me to explain in a few words why it matters to the ICRC. In the last 4 decades, the teaching of IHL in universities around the world has progressed steadily. This is in large part due to the growing interest in this body of law, as many of the world's most mediatized conflicts involves debates around the respect for IHL, among other things, of course. The emergence of international criminal justice as a discipline and the role of the internet may also be considered as important contributing factors for that success. Finally, this evolution is also largely due to the commitment of lecturers, many of them supported directly or indirectly by the International Committee of the Red Cross, National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, and other institutes. As a result, today, we estimate that the 100 universities all over the world, mostly on IHL-related issues. Thanks to digital technologies, IHL teaching has expanded, even if in most cases it still represents a small segment of public international law or international relations programs. But if there is one body of law which by design applies in crises such as armed conflict or even a pandemic, it is of course IHL. In these situations, of course, the pandemic adds another layer of misery to people already affected by armed conflict. And this is where, for us, IHL respect seems to be all the more relevant. Teaching IHL as a preventive measure should be a prerequisite combined with other measures to prevent violations. But one may ask, if IHL is so widely taught, and how can we explain the blatant and gruesome violations we have witnessed in recent armed conflicts? How can we, as educators, help bridge the gap between the teaching of IHL and its respect in practice? What directions should such an effort take? So the aim of this panel is to help worldwide IHL lecturers maintain and even develop their courses during crisis by encouraging innovative solutions by academic peers. So we will first hear from leading lecturers in the field of IHL, some teaching in contexts both affected by armed conflict and COVID-19. And you're most welcome, of course, to ask your questions in the chat box already. We will take them in the following discussion. Then we will hear final thoughts and key takeaways from panelists on whether and why teaching IHL in crisis can be considered or not a strategic response. But for the moment, I'd like to start this discussion by giving the floor to our first panelist, Mr. Samir Musa. Mr. Musa, you're a lecturer at the University of Palestine. From your experience, could you please tell us about teaching IHL in crisis, the possible constraints you face, and for lecturers facing similar situations, the solutions you have come up with to overcome those difficulties? You have the floor.
تفضل دكتور. مساء الخير لك ومساء الخير لجميع الحاضرين. أنا بقمة السعادة مشاركتكم هذه الحدث. وسعادتي تزيد لأنني سأشارككم وأشاطركم.
Sorry to interrupt. If I may ask you, Amani, to speak in front of the microphone because we cannot hear the live translation. Thank you so much.
أوكي. أعتذر ومشاركتي يعني سعادتي تزيد بمشاركتي ومشاركتكم تجربة حية في تدريس القانون الدولي الإنساني.
I am very pleased to participate, and I am also pleased to share with you a live experience of my teaching in the field of the international humanitarian law.
واحتراما للوقت سأتحدث في 3 قضايا رئيسية أساسية. أولها التحديات الأساسية أو العناصر البيئة المعقدة، ثم الإجراءات التي اتخذت لاحتواء هذه الظروف.
Sorry, we cannot hear you very well. If Amani, you can really speak close to the microphone. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Is it okay now? Okay. Sorry for that. Yes. I will focus first in my presentation on the main challenges that we have in our complex environment. Then I will refer to the procedures that we took into consideration to handle it.
العبء أو الأعباء الإضافية التي زادها انتشار فيروس كوفيد.
Then I will focus on the challenges related to COVID-19 as an additional burden.
أتحدث إليكم عن تحديات عاصرتها وعشت إلى جوارها خلال تدريسي في جامعة فلسطين في كلية القانون في جامعة فلسطين.
I will share with you the challenges that I faced during my teaching of the international humanitarian law in the faculty of law at the University of Palestine.
4 تحديات أساسية تقف أو وقفت أمام فكرة تدريس القانون الإنساني.
4 main challenges that faced the teaching of IHL.
الطلبة عاصروا 3 عمليات حربية واسعة أدت إلى فقدان مئات الأرواح مما أضعف الثقة لديهم في صلاحية القانون.
The students witnessed 3 large-scale military operations which led to loss of hundreds of lives and which weakened the trust in the validity of the law.
الأمل في فعالية القانون الإنساني كانوا يبرروا الفجوة الكبيرة بين الجانب النظري والجانب التطبيقي.
The loss of hope in the effectiveness of the law was actually as a result of the gap between theory and practice. And then it was not that end. There was also the situation of the 14-year of siege, which affected the aspects of life in Gaza. We are talking about a crisis also of electricity and internet.
أيضاً الحد الرابع يعني جاء في ظروف يعني أضاف عبئاً إضافياً على الظروف الراهنة.
The last challenge is COVID-19, which added an additional burden to the current environment. In the Faculty of Law, we try to develop a strategy to face these challenges. I can divide them to 2 phases, the theoretical phase and the practical phase. In the theoretical phase, we worked on the adaptation of the educational programs in the university. We created also a specialization of 12 hours of a specialization in IHL in the 4th year. These 12 hours, they also include 50% of the theoretical courses. And we also added another 50% within this course of a practical courses, such as moot courts, field training, clinical also education. The 3rd point was that we focused on having a specialized cadre. We also provided other references, traditional references and specialized references in the faculty. These theoretical procedures, they were followed by practical procedures. First of all, relevance of IHL and linking IHL to the local and the traditional situation or context. This actually added to the fact of creating hope for the students in the future. We also adopted educational tools in order to explain the international system to the students, and also to encourage the students to promote it. Through our teaching, we focused on sharing experiences of successful incidents, such as also the success of the ICRC with the farmers, also with the fishermen in Gaza. We encourage the students to join the extracurricular activities. We also encourage the students to share their opinions through also being connected to the organizational work. This actually led us to make a comparison between the situation in 2010 and 2020. The number of students registered in the focus specialization of IHL increased from 5% to 45% in 2020. In addition, the number of students involved in extracurricular activities increased from 12% in 2010 to 53% in 2020. Sorry, 2020. We also had at the end the students who are engaged in the field of IHL. And who also believe that there is justice in IHL, and even if there are some situations where there is weakness in the respect of the law. In relation to COVID-19, the Palestinians were affected by COVID-19 similar to everybody around the world. The university decided to keep or maintain the teaching of IHL, and we shifted to electronic learning or digital learning through different phases. The first step focused on self-learning through recorded lectures, videos, YouTube. The second phase, actually, we focused on the techniques that are provided by the digital platform that we have, the webinar, which actually facilitated the access of the students to digital education, especially that the University of Palestine.
يعني ترفع شعار جامعة نظامية بتقنيات إلكترونية منذ تأسيسها.
That always of having hybrid education and also digital education since its founding.
كمان أخيراً على آخر شيء شعرت أن الطلبة يحاولون يعني كالعصافير وجدوا مساحة للخروج من أزمة الحصار.
Sorry, please speak close to the mic, Amani. Thank you.
In addition, also, I felt that through this opportunity of the learning,
We cannot hear you very well.
Yes, I also lost your voice. Yeah, I also lost
now
it. Now you can hear
it's
me?
working.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, it seems the internet is coming back and go. I'm sorry for this. Yes, the last point is that I felt that the students also were able to benefit from learning, to link them with the outside also world, being also under siege. So I felt that they were like birds, able to be free and out from this isolation. A last point in relation to COVID-19, that it actually affects the practical courses.
ونحن نخطط لإجراء يعني محاكم سورية أونلاين.
And we are planning to bridge this gap, for example, through organizing an online Moot course.
أشكركم على الاستماع.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Musa. Thank you so much, Amani, for live translation. And indeed, we are very glad that we could have you still under such difficult conditions. From your intervention, I really take the richness of solutions deployed to address many different constraints, long-term constraints, constraints recently created by the COVID-19. You also mentioned even how this situation could provide for more opportunities actually to connect beyond your context. And so indeed, we will certainly come back to many of those aspects. Thank you so much for that. One key aspect you came back to several times is indeed students' motivations to create some hopes, as you mentioned, and to be clear also with students about the law, what it is not, what it can be and what it cannot be. And so now on this aspect of students' motivations, I would like to turn to our second panelist, Dr. Osama Siddique. Dr. Siddique, you are the Executive Director of the Law and Policy Research Network and an Associate Fellow of Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives in Pakistan. Regarding students' motivation, as an IHL lecturer, you may face indeed very reluctant audiences, sometimes because of the possible gap they may perceive between what international humanitarian law promises and what it is perceived to deliver. Knowing you as a lecturer generally address justice sector professionals, how would you address this perception gap when you teach IHL, Dr. Siddique? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Etienne. First of all, it's a great privilege to be part of this August panel. I must say that listening to Dr. Professor Samir Musa was incredibly inspiring, considering the complexity and challenges of his context and the innovative sort of responses. So in many ways, the COVID-related challenges are fairly similar. But as you pointed out, I sort of deal with a slightly different audience because these are mid-level to senior level policymakers, prosecutors, lawyers, judges. And so here, quite apart from the additional challenges of COVID, there are two other aspects to it. One is the sort of pedagogical challenges of teaching international law in general to a mature audience. And then, the specific challenges in this context of teaching IHL. So I have sort of come up with sort of 4 categories of challenges, which I'll very sort of briefly delineate and then sort of speak briefly about how one has responded to them. The first is, of course, the pedagogical challenge. And this is generic to a mature audience. This is not just international law or IHL, but what I've discovered is that there is more impatience. There is a dislike for structure. They don't like being lectured to. This is a bit different from a university audience. There is, of course, also greater knowledge and experience, which is really an asset when you're teaching a maturer audience. But there is also, on the flip side, a rigidity of views, because obviously people have spent time in society and certain sort of considered notions of how things work. And you will also have a maturer audience is much more interested in getting in the conversation rather than it being a pontification or a monologue. And they love to tell anecdotes. So these are additional challenges you come across when dealing with a mature audience. Now, talking about the sort of perception gap, there is a certain cynicism about international law in general, and IHL is a part of that. And this can be because of various reasons, which I've perceived. Either it is because some people believe that ultimately it's realpolitik which prevails, or that international law is nothing but just another name for politics, or because they are very well informed in the domain of what they do, but less informed about the direct and indirect ways in which international humanitarian law impacts society. Now, the third thing which I want to say is the other sort of pedagogical sort of challenge, or a challenge of perception, which is how law in books translates into law in practice. Now, mind you, this is also true for college students. This is equally true in a context where you have a university audience or domestic law. But I think it is more pronounced in the case of international law because of well understood reasons about jurisdictions, about alienation, about lack of information. So that's the fourth sort of challenge. And third challenge. The fourth challenge, which I want to talk about, because I also do a lot of work in the context of rule of law reform. And oftentimes, this impacts criminal justice systems, this impacts rule of law programs, is that a lot of international rule of law programs, which are directed at conflict-ridden zones or adjacent areas, have a security approach, right? So the entire idea here is to work in the context of insurgency, domestic terrorism, conflict, and as opposed to a human rights approach, right? So that can create a lot of cynicism as well as doubt. If it's a hybrid approach or if it's a security approach, disguised as a international humanitarian law approach or an international human rights approach. Those are the four sort of generic kinds of challenges which one. I have several sort of observations in terms of response. At the first point, the pedagogical. The participatory and conversational approach I found is much more effective in teaching a mature audience, or for some of us, it requires unlearning so that we turn into more multifarious teachers and not just as lecturers. Also, I think class preparation for a mature audience is a dynamic process. You don't just prepare in advance, you keep inventing and responding as you proceed. I think there have to be very clear learning outcomes. There has to be informality, especially with a mature audience, but you cannot relinquish control over the class, because as I said, they like anecdotes, they like to take over, there's some very dominating personalities. It's also very important to build on their experiences, what they share in class, and especially the IHL practitioners. But even if it's not an IHL practitioner, it's somebody who's from a relevant area, I think you can use that, and so that it becomes a collective learning experience. The anecdotal also has a role. It's not as if it's not useful, but you have to be very considered. And then, of course, role-playing and group activity are very important. Coming to the second point of countering cynicism, and I'm keeping a close eye on the clock as well. I think it's very, very important to highlight successes. I think a lot of the cynicism can be countered by the fact that there is relatively little information about the fact where IHL has worked. And there are, of course, incredibly inspiring stories. I think it's also very important while sort of tackling cynicism to be able to tell what exactly is the source of the cynicism. Is it an ideological and normative disagreement? Is it the perception that politics hijacks the law, or that law is just another name for politics? Or is it cynicism about implementation? Because surely these are different categories, and the response will also have to be different. The other point I mentioned was about bridging the gap between law in books and law in practice. And I think the onus on a lot of us as professors, as teachers, is to ensure that we also convincingly establish our credentials as people who understand the real world, especially when you're dealing with an audience which has far more experience there. So I think that's where your own practical experience in the field, as well as the kind of groundwork that you have done, becomes important. Otherwise, you can be categorized as someone bookish or theoretical or out of touch with reality. I think one has to be very honest where there are contradictions in the law, where there are flaws in the law, where there are lacunae, whether it's the security versus the human rights approach or any other aspect of international humanitarian law, because we're all agreed that it's a complex discipline. It's a discipline which has various facets to it. And much as we are very inspired and persuaded by the normative framework and the ideology behind it, there is a lot which needs to be tackled. I think context is also vital. So when you're teaching in a particular country or a particular region, and I get the chance to teach not just in South Asia, but also Southeast Asia, what are the supporting norms? What are the supporting cultural aspects and processes in the local context, which can be useful in terms of what you are disseminating? The interdisciplinary approach is another point which I would like to emphasize. I'm increasingly a sociologist of law, and I think without social context, political context, you can't really have just a very sort of textual legal approach to things. And this is something which one of my panelist colleagues, Professor Sanchin, will also elaborate on. So I'll just let it be as far as that is concerned. The final few points. I think another aspect where I find that there are ambiguities are the linkages between international law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and then of course their domestic counterparts. And I think that's an area which needs special emphasis when you're sort of elaborating on this entire theme. Professor Musa spoke about technology. I believe my colleague, Ms. Nelly Commande, will also speak about that. So I shall just restrict myself to saying that I think what COVID has also taught us is a tremendous amount of versatility in terms of how to use technology. And I think it's been a great learning experience where we need to do much more in order to create the classroom environment, in order to ensure that we motivate people. It's been doubly difficult to motivate people and to make them stay focused. Final 2 points. One is a very sort of seemingly small point, but I think there are a lot of cognitive studies and which now tell you that different people respond in different ways to teaching. So there are people who respond much better to the diagrammatic and the visual and not the textual. So I found it incredibly useful to use the diagrammatic and the visual in sort of support of the textual. And I think that, so the variation in terms of your teaching techniques, teaching tools, and the kinds of things you can do in class to promote interactivity, I think those become very important. I'm sure a lot of my colleagues are already cognizant of that and doing wonderful innovations. And the final thing is data. Lawyers are not necessarily known to dabble in data too much. And whether that's qualitative data or quantitative data, but I think it becomes incredibly useful at times to reinforce a particular line of reasoning and a particular argument if you also selectively sort of use data. Maybe we'll get an opportunity to elaborate on some of these things in the questions and answers, but my time is up and I shall stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siddique, for those rich insights and reflections. Many points indeed we will hopefully come back to. But from your intervention, really what I take is this proactive approach, which is required to teach IHL, to convince that it works, to convince that it matters. And so it seems that all IHL lecturers need to be some kind of activists. And this is maybe a point we will need to come back to, but very interested in hearing also the audience thoughts on that aspect and the solutions they come up with also to convince the students that indeed it matters, it is relevant. But one key point in that regard, and you also mentioned it, is to make IHL relate to something familiar to students, to their context, to their realities. And so this is a key point, and this is a question I would like to ask to our next panelist, Professor Vasilka Sanchin. Professor Sanchin, you are a professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And my question to you, which may appear a simple one, but is a very difficult one, is what is your recipe to stimulate students' interest by connecting IHL to their realities, to their context? Thank you, Professor Vasilka Sanchin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Etienne. And first of all, I would like to greet everyone and thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this very important webinar to share my experience. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, with whom we cooperate for many, many years at the university, and without their partnership, many of our projects wouldn't have been possible. So thank you very much for that as well. And I'm also pleased that I have the opportunity to now participate in a seminar co-organized by the British Institute for International and Comparative Law. Now, I would like to share with you, on top of what has already been said by the two predecessors who spoke before me, that for me there are three key messages, and that is that a lecturer who, of course, needs to be passionate about the subject and needs to also, in addition to usual curricular and extracurricular activities, respect and ensure that the students have access to study materials in the local language, and that is in the physical as well as online format. And I'm saying that because For perhaps the native English speakers, there is a plethora of material available, both in physical and especially in online form. However, for students in countries who do not perhaps speak official UN languages as their first languages, this is not necessarily so. And regardless of the level of the foreign language that the students speak, it is still different if they have access to the material, to the literature, to the case studies in their own official or, let's say, local language of the country. And I find this extremely important, in particular in times of crisis, where it is impossible to meet in classrooms in a physical sense and to explain to the students with your own national terminology for the relevant notions of IHL and so on. And they need to have access to these materials in the local language, which of course requires from the lecturers additional effort to prepare these materials, of course, not just author them, but also to share what is written by others in the language the students speak as their first language. Then the second key message, I think, is you need to ensure to also take students out of the classroom. So either physically or virtually. And what do I mean by that? I think that it is very important to reach out of academic circles and really connect with practice, what Dr. Siddique already mentioned, but not so much to ensure really the sustainability of the course from the side of the decision makers, but to really sensitize also the stakeholders about the importance of IHL for their work, and consequentially make the course more attractive for the students, because they would also then see the possibilities for their future potential employment. So I call this more like a bottom-up approach to ensure sustainability of the course. Take students out of the classrooms, talk to practitioners, talk to the relevant stakeholders, and show the various possibilities that the students have for their work later on, not just for the passion for IHL, but also for a real career opportunity later on after they graduate. And the third key message that I want to share is that I find it equally important to bring practitioners to the classroom. So take students out of the classroom and bring practitioners to the classroom, again, physically or virtually, if in times of crisis it is impossible to bring them physically at your university. I think this is particularly important because at the same time, it ensures ownership of the practitioners and the responsibility for teaching the future generations of individuals who will be involved in various important tasks connected to IHL, but it also raises the importance of the subject matter for the students, because they see that if the practitioners take the time to come to the classrooms to participate in online webinars or exercises and so on, then this issue must be really so important that is worth, if I can say so, investing into, not just for the better of humanity, but also in terms of, you know, their later possibilities for their later employment opportunities. So very briefly, I want to say that the international humanitarian law has been taught at the University of Ljubljana since its inception, which is now over 100 years ago. And I'm very proud to say that the first comprehensive textbook on, at that time called The Law of War and Neutrality, was already published in Slovenian language in 1942 by Professor Tomšič, so long before we even got our own independent country. And so there is a lot of interest of our students to engage with the subject matter, and we are teaching IHL within the obligatory course of Public International Law, which is mandatory for all students. The entire course is lectured in the amount of 150 hours, and significant part of it is devoted to IHL issues. And then we have a separate selective course at the second level of studies, which is called the Law of Armed Conflict, in 45 hours, in the amount of 45 hours. So you can see that the students who are interested really get an opportunity to engage with the subject matter very well. On top of that, we have a lot of interest from the students in writing theses, master theses, PhD theses in the field of international humanitarian law. And then we also stimulate a lot of extracurricular activities that are connected to IHL. For example, we are organizing an annual competition called the All European International Humanitarian and Refugee Law Moot Court Competition, with the support of the IRCRC and also UNHCR. And here we can already see also this interdisciplinarity that Dr. Siddique was mentioning earlier. We are connecting the issues of IHL to the challenges of migrations, which are, of course, affecting the entire world, including European countries and Slovenia as well. So we are offering other forms of interaction with IHL topics within, let's say, Model United Nations simulations that we are organizing at our law school. And then I think it is very important also that we try to show to the students that IHL is not relevant only for, let's say, Slovene armed forces or for the Ministry of Defense, but also for various other ministries. And we are always trying to find an opportunity to cooperate on perhaps a small project with the students with our national Commission for Implementation of International Humanitarian Law. So Slovenia has a pretty well functioning, I could say, national commission, and we are always offering them a possibility to designate a certain small task that will be to their interest, to conduct a small analysis on certain issues that they could benefit from. And the students thus get an opportunity to see how these topics are relevant also for the Ministry of Health, for the Ministry of Transportation, if you will. And in the recent years, we have really tried to instigate more interest for the students to also think about the connections between, for example, IHL and the space law. And since, for example, our Ministry of Commerce is also responsible and Ministry of Transportation are responsible for these topics, we are also engaging with them to stimulate more interest with the students to study these issues of potential use of various techniques in outer space where specific rules apply. So there are a number of activities that we have been stimulating and supporting for the students to take part in, which of course wouldn't have been possible if there wasn't a willingness on the side of the stakeholders to engage. And how do we stimulate such an interest? By trying to show the mutual benefits that are created with such cooperations. As I said, on the one side, students engage with practical aspects of the applications of IHL, which are then also perhaps beneficial for the relevant participants from both the governmental sector and the non-governmental sector, because we always try to see whether there are, and there are certainly non-governmental organizations interested in the area of IHL, and we particularly cooperate with the National Red Cross Society of Slovenia. And at the same time, by doing so, we show to the decision makers that teaching of IHL is justified regardless of whether we are in a situation or near to the area of ongoing armed conflicts, because its applicability goes beyond just, of course, the primary purpose of alleviating the suffering during the hostilities. So that would be all from my side for this initial intervention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sanchin, for this very rich contribution. And indeed, about contextualizing your teaching, I would say it's more anchoring it really in your context with creating as many links as you can, starting with the textbooks in national language and ending up with really connection with any kind of professional sectors for students, opportunities, and also the use of academics by those sectors, so the mutual benefit approach. I would like also to emphasize how probably yourself embody an example for students willing to engage in those aspects, because you are also a member of the UN Human Rights Committee and also a lecturer. So that must also play a big role for female students as a model role. Another aspect maybe we will have the opportunity to touch upon later on. Indeed, with this, we have now explored some of the main aspects and constraints teaching IHL in crisis entails. We have seen the possible solutions to deal with those constraints. We have also reflected upon the possible perception gap between the black letter of the law and its perceived effects. We have also now just seen how to connect teaching of IHL to local context in many different ways. And now maybe what we need to hear more about is, on top of all of that, how can we help lecturers secure courses, especially in a context such as the current one of global pandemic marked with confinement. And so to address this question of really securing teaching beyond the crisis, I'd like to give the floor to our fourth and last panelist, Ms. Nelly Kamunde, to address this question about how can lecturers maintain their courses throughout the pandemic and beyond, and also looking at digital solutions to do so. So Ms. Kamunde, you have been a lecturer for more than a decade at Kenyatta University in Kenya, but you also specialize in technology for public legal education and empowerment. And so my question to you would be, what are your recommendations to help lecturers secure their IHL courses, and what technological solutions could they turn to do so? Nelly, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen from all over the world, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I'll begin by just being appreciative of the fact that we're around. These are unusual and extraordinary times, so I'm grateful for that. I'll start my first point, and I have to say that firstly, it's difficult to speak after such an extraordinary panel. It was quite inspiring from all of you. I'll see what has been left out so that I do not have to repeat myself. So my first point is just to think of this particular forum as a way of enhancing standards for teaching. The organization, and we're appreciative of that, the British Institute of Comparative and International Law, indicates something we could all use as lectures from time to time. And that is using panels like this to share our experiences, as I have learned a lot myself. And this is a platform of Zoom. It's free for most of the time until somebody requires extra customization. So I'll start by talking about these kinds of forums where we get to share resources and our expertise in different areas, and we all go back to our respective universities so that we can implement them. As Etienne put it very well, I have a bit of experience first in teaching undergraduate students, and I've also had the privilege of working with peacekeeping forces through the Gender and Peace Support Operations. And that has given me some insight of instructing IHL to people who are in peace support operations in the field. So I'll speak on the part of students, and without really repeat what Dr. Siddique put very eloquently, is that mature students do not like being lectured. So whether you're doing the communication online, whether you're doing the discussion physically, there always has to be a tone and variance in style that suggests you are facilitating their understanding and not particularly lecturing them. For university students who are much younger audience, who are, I think they consider screens for purposes of entertainment more than for learning, I was surprised in the last semester to learn that we can actually not meet the entire semester with our students, and we were able to, to conduct the entire semester's work and even do the exam. And I was very happy that the results were not shocking. What does this tell us? It tells us that we had the opportunity all this time to use digital learning and use it effectively and adapt to it. So the first thing I would like to say is that I think human beings have the capacity to adopt. Human beings want to move on. They want to do those courses and certificates and education that they were supposed to do and not waste their time. That's a positive side. But then the question I would ask myself, and to hit really the nail on the head on my question, is what exactly can we do to make sure that we don't lose the pedagogical and andragogical vigor of being physically present with each other? So briefly speaking, my experience was in designing a digital platform, which were web-based and others were Android-based, which means we created applications, mobile apps that could work on Android phones. And they were based on the idea of empowering people who cannot access a legal classroom. And it was public education. So it was focusing on ordinary Kenyans who wanted to know how to incorporate a company, their civil rights, a bit of just criminal establishment and so on. So there are a number of lessons I derived from it. One of them is that I can speak of my context, is that sometimes we overrate literacy. In I say computer literacy. Sometimes we overrate access to resources such as the mobile phones we need. So they say, for example, the highest country with the country with the highest penetration of smartphones is about 80 to 90%, and that is very, very far from where we are, very far from Africa, very far from Asia. So there's always a need to investigate what is the kind of hardware that is available for students from wherever they are. I've seen certain efforts, some of them from very benevolent NGOs who come and they start a learning center, digital learning center. What it means is that the students do not all have access to a computer, but they have access to a screen or a place where projection could be used. So what happens is that the teacher is far away, but the students are together, of course, maintaining social distance. So the point I'm trying to make, even as IHL is concerned, is the need to explore our ideas of digital learning so that we don't overrate its capacities, so that we still need to work hard as lecturers, as teachers, as people who disseminate IHL, so that we don't commit everything to a screen and a face and a button to click. So now, when we design the course or learning outcomes for a classroom where we're meeting in a lecture hall, there are a number of things we do. So we prepare package material, and then the rest of them happen from a digital space, whether it's on email sharing, whether it's a WhatsApp group, whether it's Blackboard, or and so on and so forth. Now, this means that already we had certain platforms that were working online. But then the burden of the course disseminator still remains, because they have to creatively think of how to excite the audience so that they learn. IHL is particularly interesting because it's a course that doesn't have a normal context. It has a context of violence. It has a context of conflict. And I really enjoyed the presentation by Professor Samir Musa, who talked really of, a situation that I don't think many people have experienced, where the student get to question the reality of IHL or its hopefulness. So when we are teaching IHL, what we can extract as capacity from digital platforms is to find that platform which gives us the ability to tweak it to our context. So we use Google Meet, we use Teams, we use Zoom as we are right now, and some of them can be enabled so that you get a license for more capacity. There is no harm, of course, keeping within the ethics of exploring virtual reality in teaching those subjects that have a context outside of our normal life. For example, I've seen young people play games, most of those games, and I see the International Review of the Red Cross wrote a fantastic article about incorporating IHL rules in virtual reality games. So the game assumes that someone is a soldier and shooting everybody. I've seen one of my nephews play it, but he wouldn't know what is IHL. For example, learning and learners could be enticed, not actually learners, but the companies that make games eventually could attempt to incorporate something, even if it's a role, because what happens is that in learning, a creativity and curiosity of a learner could be sparked by just one little thing, so that someone suffers in the game if they kill an innocent civilian, if they bomb a well or something like that. So the virtual reality, the point I was making there, allows us to get almost a virtual practical experience if we do it within the rules of ethics. One of the things that the digital platform that I call Sharia tips, and Sharia, it's not Sharia, it's Sharia, which in Swahili means law. So what it was just to send out tips. Yeah, so sending out tips to people, and then you kind of stir their curiosity. And I was thinking about this in the context of reaching the non-ordinary audiences for IHL. So in other words, what we would do is to use this simple Windows-based phone, because it's a very simple, it just goes in the form of an SMS, to reach people who are, I don't know, they could be in a forest in Congo, they could be in a place where we don't get to organize a hotel for IHL dissemination. And all it would be to send sparks of information where people would experience almost just an attitude change. They would see that someone sat down and set up the information to tell them this is a sacrosanct value. If there is a conflict, if there's violence, then that should not be breached. I wouldn't want to make it too easy, because as my colleagues have said, IHL is a field where we all agree on the values, but sometimes we disagree on how to achieve those values. So the last, I don't know how my time is, it's close. I would want to say that I think a lot can be achieved with digital learning. Yeah, sharing of resources, where what we are doing right now. If you invite a child soldier to speak about his context at the right time, it always excites the emotion and changes the attitude of the listener, and they think about what they have learned from a much deeper context, and it's not just theory for them anymore. So this is what digital learning can help us do. And sometimes I wonder why in class I wasn't inviting Etienne randomly to give a lecture, or Professor Siddique and so on. So it has helped us to really think of how sometimes much faster we would have done things, and even enhanced learning despite the anxiety of the COVID pandemic. I'll close by saying that nothing is without its challenges, that we are still learning. We are yet to invent or come up with the perfect solutions to the crisis or to enhance learning. There are a number of challenges that must be overcome. And I'm certain, like with these forums and exchange, we'll set standards and all will be well. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to one or two questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Nelly, for these interesting ideas and initiatives. Indeed, you mentioned many different tools, digital tools, important to share first and foremost materials and exchange ideas. And indeed, the current Zoom platform we use is one of those. You also underlined how you need to adapt to practical realities in context, and also to go beyond the classroom. You mentioned also the use of video games and other media to reach out to the audience. And so many interesting points to expand on. Now I would like to get back to the floor, because we've received a certain number of questions, and I would like to thank the audience very much for those. I'll try to take them in a logical order so that the discussion follows smoothly. And maybe we need to get back to the basics, and I would like to start with a question which is by Ellen Walker from Rights Tech Women, about the need assessment any lecturer needs to do prior to teaching. So if you want to make your teaching relevant and tailored for adult learners in particular, what needs assessment tools you have used, and any comments you would like to have on those. So this is a question I throw at the whole panel before drafting your course outline, before for planning your course, whether it is a semester course or a specific executive training course, for instance, for professionals, what kind of need assessment do you proceed to, and what kind of tools do you use for that? So I don't know if there is anybody in the panel who would like to react on that right now.
I've
Yes.
raised my hand. Maybe that's...
Yes, please, Dr. Siddique.
Okay, thank you. Just to keep the conversation flowing, I'm sure my colleagues will have a lot more to say on that. I want to make, first of all, the vital distinction that what I've learned from several mistakes is to restrict myself to my game plan, which I've formulated in view of whichever class I'm teaching. And since my audience is changing, judges, prosecutors, or it could be civil servants, of course, actually, you do your own due diligence and you find out at what level of seniority these people are proceeding. Their work profiles may not be consistent, they may be different. And of course, the client or the government, whoever your counterpart is, also communicates the kind of learning outcomes they want from this particular course. And that is indeed the starting point. But I have discovered that in almost any class or course that I've taught, I really get to grips with what exactly I should be doing a few sessions into the course. A lot of people are inhibited at first to speak out. Others are too vocal and they tend to dominate the conversation. There are those who have a tendency to disrupt, and there are others who add value. So I think you really need to develop a dynamic approach as you proceed. And in order to see who are your champions in the class without any favoritism, the ones who will really deepen the argument and promote it, who are the distractors, how do you diplomatically deal with them? So that's the bifurcation of the game plan into the pre and the during the course. Now, as to sort of further, so as much information as you can get about people and their background and the kind of courses they've done, I think you also get a fairly good indication as to what style of teaching they like. The other is, once again, as I said, if you are using multiple techniques, so you have, and I really liked what Professor Sanchin said about taking the students out, bringing outsiders in, that really makes a huge difference at multiple levels, not just for the sustainability of the course, but for also all the reasons that she spoke about. I think it's important that you have a combination of role-playing, a combination of short presentations, some lecture where you really need to lay down the doctrine or to enunciate it clearly, a lot of question answer sessions. So yeah, there are multiple tools which can be used, and that then will allow different people who have different skill sets, like in a university context, to thrive in what they are comfortable with and have a sense of participation in the class. So I think both in terms of sustaining their interest and also in terms of making sure that you pitch what you're trying to teach at the right level, not too high, not too low, although you may want to progressively make it more competitive. I think it becomes important to do a lot of this Sherlock Holmes kind of research on your class before and during the.
If I may, Etienne, just say something.
Yes, please. I will also have Mr. Musa on my list, but please, you go first, Vasilka.
Thank you. I very much agree with what Dr. Siddique just said. It's very important to provide the students with the opportunity for role play. And I usually provide them with hypothetical examples, of course, discussing the real events as well. But for the role play, I choose hypothetical examples so they feel more free to engage in various roles without having any pictures in their minds of atrocities being committed and so on in different parts of the world. Here, I think what is very important for them to understand, to learn from this exercise, is the importance of teamwork. the exercises that I share with the students are such that necessarily require cooperation among a number of students, so that they really also understand that while, of course, the contribution of each individual in implementation of IHL is very important, for the real success in practice, you need to cooperate with others. You need the teamwork. You need to develop also these skills. And I think this is one way of how you can approach the students and try to, stimulate them to engage in such exercises. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Moussa, if you would like to take the floor, please, on that, the assessment tools you use to prepare your course. Thank you.
شكرا على هذا السؤال. نحن في جامعة فلسطين اليوم في 2020 كان لدينا الخطة الثالثة لمجال التركيز القانون الدولي الإنساني.
Sorry, we cannot hear you, Amani.
Can you hear me now? Is it okay now?
Yes, it is.
It is now? Okay, thank you. Thank you for this question. At the University of Palestine, we had a discussion in 2020 to build our third plan of our focused IHL course. In every stage that we had a plan to develop the courses, the plan of our courses. And this system that we followed was a participatory system in the university. This was in cooperation between the deanship of the Faculty of Law and also with the quality departments in the university. And it was also in cooperation with the students themselves and also the local community. This actually depended on several criteria. First of all, the opinions of the graduates. Second, the opinions of the practitioners. The opinions of the official bodies, accompanied by the academic results, the quality of researches, also the understanding of students. All this participatory process, after all this participatory process, we reach actually to updating our plan of courses. For example, before we didn't have a course named International Committee of the Red Cross. After the interactive relation with the ICRC and also the desire of the students to understand the mandate of the ICRC, and also the connection between the ICRC and IHL, we found out that it is important to have a course about the ICRC. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, taking the opportunity of having you, I have maybe two follow-up questions, especially for you from Mr. Ahmed Aboful. So one for Mr. Moussa, which is what kind of, is there any kind of cooperations from the University of Palestine with other universities in Palestine, and how those basically contribute to benefit students? So that would be the first follow-up question for Mr. Moussa, and a second one, which is more related to the work of the ICRC in Gaza, especially in view of the support we provide to lecturers. So Amani, that would be for you. We don't have much time remaining, so if you can please go to the essentials. You're on mute.
واحدة من أهم الخطوات هي العمل إلى جوار الطلبة. هناك عمل كبير في جامعة فلسطين وجامعة الأزهر والجامعة الإسلامية في ثقافة.
One of our main elements that we focus on is actually making the students work together. We have cooperation between the University of Palestine, Al-Azhar University, and the Islamic University of Gaza. And we have also participatory activities that supported this cooperation. We also have exchanges of lecturers between all these universities. Tamam. Can you
Thank
hear
you.
us?
And yes, and then the follow-up question. Thank you for these insights, Mr. Musa. And then the question, especially addressed to you, I believe, Amani, about the role of the ICRC in Gaza in view of the support that can be given to lecturers to teach IHL at large in Arabic, in English. So if you can give us an overview of the work you English. So if you can again for that.
Thank you. The ICRC actually has a prevention program with academic circles that, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Yes, thank you. So the ICRC actually has a prevention program with academic circles in Gaza that supports the promotion and integration of IHL into the faculties of law as a main focus. And this program actually focuses on two main things. First of all, the capacity building of professors in Gaza to be able to teach and integrate the international humanitarian law. And the second point is actually encouraging university professors on teaching IHL outside the classroom through organizing with them extracurricular activities that support their teaching of IHL and engage the students in understanding the law in a practical manner. And this includes IHL summer schools, moot courts, other extracurricular activities that actually depend on the participatory approach between the ICRC and all the universities in Gaza, exchange experiences to enhance also peer-to-peer learning and support the ownership and later on to be able to depend on themselves. The ICRC as well, of course, support also all the universities with their references that they need to be able to teach IHL whether in Arabic or in English. And there is also another focus with the universities to engage them also in thematic discussions in relation to IHL on themes that are related in specific to the context that we have here. So together we could organize roundtable discussions or focused workshops to better understand the law and analyze it and come out with a product in Arabic that can be helpful also in the future for researchers and academic circles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like now to turn to maybe Ms. Nelly Kamunde and Dr. Siddique, because there was also a question about and sorry, I cannot find the question back, so I quote it, trying to remember it just like that. It's a question about the specifics one lecturer may address when teaching soldiers. So I know that Nelly, you mentioned you had experience with peacekeeping forces, and Dr. Siddique, you indeed teach professionals. So maybe, I don't know, Nelly, first, if you would like to expand on any specifics that one needs to look at as an academic lecturer when addressing soldiers.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Etienne, for that question. Briefly speaking, I have interrogated how best to do that. I wouldn't prescribe a specific formula. In law, they talk about mostly the Socratic method of teaching. And as we all know, it's a style of, getting to ask questions so that the knowledge is built progressively, and it almost comes from the audience. So a number of times I teach using stories, and some of them could be, of course, without naming names of places where the participants do mention something. We don't get into at least the forums I've had, we don't get into the details of controversial areas of IHL. So a number of times it's a foundational course. You are looking at proportionality, what it is, how is it applied, and so on and so forth. the common stories like, Boko Haram would always come up, terrorism, how do you deal with it? And we have, for example, discipline forces from the Kenyan side, and they go to a place where everybody is disobeying the law. So some of them don't really have specific answers, but I kind of adopt a very liberal approach, which is also respectful to the experiences of people who are in the actual field of operation. So the first session I had was quite difficult because I was speaking very theoretically, but by and by I learned how to tweak my experiences so that we are talking about sharing of values that come from somewhere, that comes from innate in us. So IHL has a bit of an inclination to natural law theory. So I try to come from there, that we have something shared, and out of that, then we can design rules that would be favorable for both sides, regardless of the political ideals. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Dr. Siddique, if you'd like to expand on that. Otherwise, I also have a follow-up question. Dr. Siddique.
Very briefly, I think it's already been very well answered. I'll just add very briefly that the closer one is to a conflict, the more emotive that situation is. And that can be a fairly distracting and potentially even disruptive thing, So like other contexts, Pakistan also has various areas which have been in conflict, and there are associations and memories and perceptions. But so I think I quite agree that if you can sort of turn it into a hypothetical, and so like the Socratic method, the other technique which was pretty much invented by the law school is the case study. So case studies can be quite useful in terms of creating a real life situation, but not quite naming it, so that people can have the candor and the lack of inhibition to be able to sort of question even well received notions. The other is, as I said earlier, to see if to what extent local normative frameworks, to the extent that they are supportive of what the international humanitarian normative frameworks are, can also be used. There's a common sort of recourse to humanity, which applies through various cultures and situations. And I think that can be very helpful. So I think this is something which has to be approached quite delicately. And I quite agree with what Ms. Kamande has said in terms of the other things which one has to bear in mind.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for also raising the question of the hypothetical. You know that at the ICRC we have both, we work with fictitious case studies indeed, but we also have a reference tool called How Does Law Protect in War, and also a platform called IHL in Action. I'll try to share the links in the chat box later on, which builds on publicly available reports and facts in order to ask questions about implementation of IHL. So maybe on that, there was also a question about possible reference to pop culture examples as fictitious examples that may even better resonate with students. And sometimes we think that IHL is indeed a very serious matter, because this is a body of law which deals with people's life, literally speaking. So is it for you lecturers, and this is a question I throw at the entire panel, is it acceptable to use pop culture to speak about, I don't know, Star Wars or Harry Potter to teach IHL? Would there be some caveat, or can it be opportune in certain contexts and with certain audiences? So just willing to throw that question out for you to take and checking the No hands raised so far. You raise your hands, please, Dr. Siddique.
So I am a great believer in sort of going outside the domain of the doctrinal and the traditional. So I've taught a course several times in colonial law and its post-colonial ramifications, where I use actually a lot of cinema. I use a lot of movies from Hollywood, which revolve around that, around colonialism and around law as a despotic force. I think at the same time, I think, as we all know, law and literature is a very sort of well-established field now and used very effectively. And literature, so many books can be cited, which are amazing in terms of humanizing the impact of law and even the asymmetric impact of law, whether it's in the context of international law or domestic law. I think there's absolutely no harm in using pop culture. You need to use your audience. I think the only balance which needs to be struck is whether you can strike a balance between a certain formality and sort of sobriety to what you're doing, because it is serious business, and so that it does not get perceived as something which is completely frivolous. But while there's absolutely no harm in having some fun, and I think if you can make it relatable to your particular audience, that's always a strength as a teacher.
Thank you very much for that. I think we also had a question from Professor Sander in the chat about how to differentiate between, let's say, being proactive as an IHL lecturer and being an activist. So in other terms, how to keep one's neutrality in circumstances where you need actually to go beyond just teaching the law, but to convince that the law matters and is relevant. And so, yeah, I don't know if I framed the question correctly, or if Professor Sander, you would like to expand on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's, well, first of all, just fantastic presentations, everyone. Really enjoying the vibrant discussion. And I think you framed it excellently, Etienne. I'm just really interested in this line between teaching and activism, and the space which you provide in your classrooms for critique, including radical critique potentially. And, you know, do you, for example, state your personal position and allow that to kind of float in the classroom? And that's, you know, that's fine. Do you try and maintain an air of neutrality and allow all voices to just kind of flow? I'm just interested in this management of critique, activism, and teaching. And it's a question open to anyone.
Thank you so much indeed, a big one. So we'll wait for hands to. So no hands so far. Anybody wants to take that? That's a difficult one. Ah, yes,
Yeah,
Dr. Siddique again. Yes, please.
I don't want to hog the panel, but I just thought that to the extent that others are still considering it, there's no simple answer to this. I think it's easier said than done. If you are a constitutional lawyer, if you are an international human rights person, in many ways, the effectiveness of teaching flows from the passion you yourself have for the subject, whether it's ideological or as a discipline. So I think passion has to be maintained. That ideological commitment can't be taken away. But I think it can be ensured that you're not pontificating. It can be ensured that you have enough space in class for divergent opinions. And I think one has to make a conscious effort to do that, that nobody's argument is denigrated and nobody feels inhibited to question. So I think outright activism as a teacher is not a good idea. I think there needs an internal sort of boundary which we define ourselves as to what extent are we going to exhort someone to listen to our argument. Now, I come from a disciplinary sort of bent where I'm inspired by the critical legal studies movement. And so we tend to question everything. We tend to have a heterodox approach. We tend to question formal law. So I think that in some ways enhances the possibility to create a culture in class where everything can be questioned. And you can argue it vociferously, and then you just leave it there with the value and the merit of your argument rather than further emotional pressure as an activist. So a very hard one, and I think every person will strike a different balance. But I think we all need to be conscious of the fact that we can falter in one direction or the other, and we need to be mindful of that.
Thank you, Dr. Siddique. Professor Sanchin, you wanted also to add to that. Please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. This is why I think it is so important that you take the students out and the practitioners in, because then you can get the activists in to play this role. And you can also expose the students to these discussions where perhaps sometimes, you know, the actors are not applying the law exactly as written in the books due to difficult circumstances. To provide you just a very concrete example. And I hope I'm not saying too much now. Each year, I take my students also to meet with Slovene armed forces, you know, including the medical personnel. So, and then they show them, you know, how they operate in various peacekeeping missions and so on. And for example, once a student asked them, so do you always wear the protective emblem? And they said, sometimes in Afghanistan we don't, because we simply feel that that would be exposing ourselves too much, and that we will be creating more risks for our battalion than we would be useful if somebody is injured and would actually need our medical assistance. So, and of course, this is a very critical issue, and it's better that it doesn't come from me, but from somebody who really operates in the field. And then we can have a discussion, you know, why it is important to comply with the law and what are the obstacles and challenges and how to deal with this. So that's why I think it's so important to have this exposure to people who are engaged in various situations where the law sometimes is a little bit, you know, let's say, curtailed to the needs of the concrete contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to also give the floor to Nelly so that you can comment on this question of teaching proactivity, versus activism. Nelly, you have the floor. Thank you.
Etienne, I'll agree with most of what my colleagues have said. I'll make 3 points, or 2 points rather. One, it's important, as Dr. Siddique said, to approach a liberal, to take a liberal approach so that you expose the information and then you don't force your opinion on people. It's not recommended. The second point is that it always has to depend on the audience. I think I've been in situations where you even get a little bit embarrassed because you could be mentioning a context which is extremely personal to people, which even if they're on the wrong side and they suffered victimization of any kind, it's difficult for them to see the side of IHL. So one has to be extremely creative in what kind of words you use, the examples you give, and so on. The last point, and I think this one may sound a little bit controversial, is I think as somebody, maybe you're a professor or you have had so many years of experience of IHL, and IHL as a choice, right? As a choice of an academic field. So you're committed to a measure of values. So I believe, for example, depending on the audience that you're with, there is a moral obligation to kind of steer them in the right thinking, particularly when you observe there is an errant thinking where students are too active politically. I've had situations where, for example, after electoral violence or some situations which were declared in the South as armed conflict in one time, I believe there is always an obligation to kind of guide right thinking, particularly on the uncontested values of humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is a very rich discussion, and I already see some frustration by the audience because I won't be able to take all the questions. So I think I will take 2 last ones. And the first one is actually directed to Dr. Siddique, but I think it's also a question for the whole panel because it's been addressed by several panelists. Is the question of what I would call data-driven teaching. So I think there was several times the mention that you need to find some instances of respect, to find some concrete examples qualitatively and quantitatively in order to make your teaching relevant and to have students convinced that what they're actually learning makes sense. So where and how do you put this data together? And also, should we equip law faculties with courses, interdisciplinary courses, pushing lecturers to also look for such data to feed their teaching more and not just teach the black letter of the law? So that's maybe a big one. So I will welcome, let's say, overviews and short insights on that, if that is even possible, and giving maybe first the floor to Dr. Siddique and then, of course, to other panelists as deemed fit.
Thank you. Very briefly, yes. I mean, I'm a big supporter of lawyers sort of stepping out of their comfort zone and not only just using the legal methodology, but really getting more familiar with the social sciences. I think partially that's perhaps because of the kind of work I do, which requires a sociological understanding and an economic understanding of context. Also, if you work on the policy side, you need to be able to understand your interlocutors in the policymaking world. But that's also true, I think, for any branch of law, including IHL. The second part is that to the extent that one is not quite equipped to, of course, everybody has a different educational background. I had to make a tremendous effort and be proactive and to engage with political scientists and sociologists and economists and learn how they look at data. We don't always agree. As my economist friends keep saying, that lawyers ask good questions, but they have terrible methodology. And we respond to them by saying, you have great methodology, but you ask terrible questions. So I think there's an importance sort of learning which can happen from each other in terms of nuancing the questions for research and all that. And so, yeah, I mean, in my case, and that's what I encourage other colleagues, talking to people outside your discipline matters a lot, and learning about their methodology. Because I think unless you are able to interpret data, you will not be able to effectively use it in class as well.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other reaction. So maybe I would like now to take one last question before we move to the concluding phase of this panel. And that's a question from my colleague, Maria, and it's an excellent one. The question is basically for all panelists, in your experience, what have been the most successful practical tools that you used to accompany teaching? And what did students most connect with? So now for all lecturers listening to us, and I'd like to give the floor to really each panelist. If there is one tool you would recommend, a practical one, what would be that tool? Thank you so much. And I give the floor to Mr. Musa to start with. Thank you.
أكثر أداة نجحت في جلب اهتمام الطلبة هي يمكن المحاكمات السورية.
From experience, one of the tools that really worked to attract students was the moot courts.
Okay, so the moot court, would you like just to explain why and what it triggered among students?
First of all, because it has a practical aspect. And second, it encourages the motivation of the student because he sees himself when doing that. And he can also express his opinions and ideas. And he's also seen by the community. In addition, through moot courts, the student can be close to specialists, can be close to jury committees. And this is not only for those who are professionals, but also the other students around them. So other students who see their peers engaging in moot courts become encouraged also to participate in the future in such of
المشاركين والفائز يعني يشار لهم بالبنان.
Sorry, we cannot hear you.
Yeah. So moot courts can help the participants and also the winners be known in the community, and everyone pointing at them and would like to be like them.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. What I take from that is really this, again, this connection with students' reality, with professionals, with the context. So it seems from what you say that students' competitions, moot court embody basically the needs for contextualization and connection of IHL teaching to realities. I would like now to give the floor to Vasilka. Maybe if you would like to share with us one key tool you would recommend for teaching.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I agree, moot courts are very important, but I would say even more generally role playing. I think the students connect very well when they have to take the role of a particular actor in a hypothetical situation where IHL needs to be applied. And I have to tell you that whenever we have these role play exercises, I always, when we are at the university premises, always see students sitting in cafeteria, discussing, debating, preparing, even preparing additional materials, I don't know, whatever emblems they will be using, uniforms. So it is really something they connect to, and that usually stays with them long after they graduate from our law school. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Passion is definitely the word here. And with this, I would like to turn to Nelly. Maybe if you would like to share with us a key tool you would recommend that works really well in your experience to teach IHL in crisis.
Thank you again, Etienne. I won't overemphasize the Moot code, but it's an extremely useful tool, particularly the excitement. We call it, like in pedagogy, the spark. The emotional spark that gets the students to get into what you're saying. I am quite I'm a bit loyal. Etienne, if you allow me, I'll mention the Jean Pictet competition. And for me, it has had a huge impact on me professionally, and also it has had a huge impact on my teaching style. So what I do is I collect all the materials that I use there, the case studies, the forums. And maybe for our colleagues who've not had a chance to interact with that, it will be important to share, you know, the questions that simulated General Assembly, a webinar of politicians, say a forum of politicians, forces, news anchors and whatnot, because it gives live to the place where IHL plays. So I've used that a lot. Sometimes I use it in every other class that I'm teaching IHL. Very quickly and lastly, because these are, when it's an undergraduate course and we do it for 45 hours, about 15 weeks of the semester, I go step by step with how does law protect in war. And it just, you know, displays the subject to for someone who's introducing themselves to IHL. I have found it extremely useful, and it has, you know, a compilation of all the reference materials for foundational course in IHL. I sometimes don't need to get outside of the text so much. Just one last point is always carry volume 1 only in the first class, because you carry volumes, the 3 of them, and they're big, then they intimidate the students. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for this free advertisement. I did not ask for it, but indeed, I'm also a big fan of how does law protect in war myself. With this, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Siddique. For you, please, to share one preferred tool that you would recommend to fellow lecturers. Please, Dr. Siddique.
Thank you. I quite agree with the observations on the Moot court, and I particularly agree with the last point about intimidation, why it is incredibly important to safeguard against that. But I would also go with what Professor Sanchin pointed out, role play in various forms. Generically speaking, in terms of a simpler role play, but also a more complex role play in the context of the case method of teaching, whether it's a real case or a hypothetical case. It's quite remarkable how it animates people, how there's a magical transformation from relative lack of interest to a fairly passionate sort of, identification of their turf and what kind of a role they ought to play. So I think it's important that people are also flipped around into different kinds of roles and not necessarily something which they are ideologically comfortable with, so that they can also question well-held beliefs and positions. So I think that's also important. If one has that prior knowledge and information, to put people not necessarily in uncomfortable positions, but in slightly more alien situations, so that they can think out of the box and they can think more critically about their positions. So that would be my choice.
Thank you very much again for this deep reflection, Dr. Siddique. And with this, and very unfortunately, I believe we are reaching the end of this rich panel. I'd like, of course, to thank all panelists for these intakes. And of course, before we leave, I would like to ask each of you to maybe share one key takeaway with the audience to equip lecturers with and to help them in their endeavors, and also to answer this very important question which triggered this discussion: is indeed teaching IHL in crisis a strategic answer to troubled times? Why? So with this, I would like maybe to give the floor first to Mr. Musa, if you would like to share one key takeaway and answer the question whether you believe teaching IHL in crisis is a strategic answer. You have the floor, Mr.
طبعا بدون ادنى شك، يعني انا ارى انه تدريس القانون الدولي الانساني في الازمات وفي المناطق التي تعاني من النزاعات امر استراتيجي.
Sorry, closer to the mic.
لاسباب متعدده، يمكن اهمها
for many reasons.
انه هو يعني يلامس الحاجه لهذا القانون.
Sorry, we cannot hear you.
That
Yeah, we didn't hear you very well. So maybe would you like to? Yes.
Sorry, I think it's the internet problem. It keeps
now we
going.
hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me now? Good. Yeah, Dr. Samer was saying that he believes that teaching IHL in crisis or conflict zones is very strategic and important because it touches the need in such contexts. So even if there are challenges in respecting the law, we need to encourage and enhance the learning of this law because it is the future for a change.
Thank you. That's a beautiful message. And of course, I'm also a strong believer of that. But without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Siddique for his key takeaway and also his answer to the question about teaching IHL in crisis. Dr. Siddique.
Thank you. I guess one sort of upshot is that teaching is a dynamic process. I mean, you can't just have, there are definitely best practices, and we've seen a convergence amongst all of us on various things which work better than others. So I think it's important to learn from that. I've learned a lot, but I think it's also a dynamic process. So if you take this COVID era teaching remotely, one thing which you realize that you've immediately lost out by being in the classroom is to be able to observe individual students and to be able to see whether they're with you or whether they're feeling lost, right? Because that's just not possible here. So I think we'll need to keep on dynamically thinking that when things go back to normal, even if we use technology, how do we fill this gap? I think COVID in many ways reproduces the kind of alienation and the kind of disempowerment which you can also see in conflict zones, right? Because and I think it should sensitize you in many ways to that and to emphasize how communication and empathy and methodology has to evolve in order to be able to teach IHL. So I think it has been good practice for us. If anything, we should learn from it to be better equipped once things at least go back to normal in terms of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very interesting comparison between actually the pandemic and armed conflict. And without further ado, I would like now to give the floor to Professor Sanchin for your final takeaway for lecturers attending this panel and answering the question about the relevance of teaching IHL in crisis.
Yes, I think teaching of IHL in all circumstances is a strategic choice. And why? Because I firmly believe that prevention is always far less costly, both in terms of human and financial costs, than having to deal with violations if they occur in situations of armed conflict. So I firmly believe in the importance of teaching of IHL at all times, in all contexts, all around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vasilka, for that. And now the final word to Nelly for you to share your key takeaway and also the answer to the panel question. Nelly?
Okay, so my final words is I see as though there will be an end to the crisis, the pandemic, and this, just like the way all the other pandemics in the past have come to an end. The only thing I would say is that when we have developed so many tools of survival, whether for digital learning or digital meeting and whatnot, we must preserve them, because as I said earlier, we have seen their value in being able to do so much more than we saw even when the pandemic had not started. So we should guard the tools for teaching IHL. It's strategic in times of the pandemic, and it will be strategic to have blended learning even when hopefully the crisis comes to an end. That's my takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we over did it a bit because we went over the time, and apologies for that to the organizers. Before we conclude, I would like to invite the audience to continue the discussion. There is in particular a Facebook page which is called IHL in Academic Circles, which can be also a place where you connect together and you discuss. And also on LinkedIn, we have a group which is called Network of IHL Lecturers and Researchers. I try to share the link in the chat box at a later stage, but please do not hesitate to come to those areas, to these online spaces to continue the discussion and to connect with fellow lecturers because we believe firmly in the need to pursue these IHL teaching endeavors. Before we formally close, I would like really to warmly thank all of our panelists for their deep expertise, commitment, and passion, as well as my ICRC colleagues, Maria Nikolova, who provided outstanding support to set up this panel and help me conduct it, and also Amani Al-Naouk from ICRC Gaza, who also helped with the live translation and the preparation. Last but not least, I would like to offer my really sincere thanks to the British Institute for International and Comparative Law for this unique opportunity to address such an important topic, and to all of you attending this event for your interest and rich questions. With this, we wish you all a great evening, a great morning or afternoon, and send our kindest regards. Please take good care. Thank you very much, and over to the organizers.
Thank you very much, Etienne, and thank you very much to all of the panelists. This has been absolutely wonderful and really, really interesting, and so much to learn from the experience and passion of all the panelists. So thank you very much. All I have to do is say thank you very much to the people at Bickle, especially the events team, for their support today, especially Liam, who has been in the background for the last 3.5 hours, making sure that Zoom works as well as it does. And the other thing is to remind everyone that the next session will be, or the next day of sessions will be in 3 weeks' time. So that is on Friday, the 19th of February, where we will be having 2 panels, one looking at the promises and perils of the pedagogy of international law in the Philippine state of exception, and then the afternoon session, which will be looking at critical perspectives on teaching international law. If you have colleagues, etc., who are interested, please do ask them to register. If you are already registered, as you probably are, considering that you are here, you will receive a reminder of this the day before. However, and obviously the link, etc., will all be circulated again at the time. With that in mind, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much, Etienne, and the colleagues at ICRC. Thank you very much, Liam and Barry. And have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.